Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the Fujifilm GFX100, and this is their Mark II. So this is the follow-up to their flagship medium format camera. Comes obviously in a new body style. There's no integrated vertical grip here. It has a gorgeous new wrapper in terms of the textures and the finish of the materials on it. It has a brand new sensor, an updated autofocus system, a much deeper pool of video-centric features. And it also, on top of all of that, has a price slash from $10,000 down to $7,500. So I think the question to be asked and answered as a part of this review is, has Fuji brought enough to the table with the GFX100 Mark II to convince some full-frame shooters to jump ship and to make the switch over to Fujifilm's medium format? I think I can help to answer that question today right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So let's start by taking a look at what we have got here as far as the features and the handling of the camera. So obviously, as mentioned already, there is no integrated vertical grip in this new model. And so if you want a battery grip, it's going to cost you an additional $500. You know, that being said, they're still $2,000 less than what the original GFX100 was. So it seems like a pretty fair bargain, all things considered. And of course, not everyone wants that integrated battery grip. I'm one of those people who prefers this style of body. While I know that some of you do enjoy a vertical grip, but of course you can add that for a not unreasonable amount of money. Now, this new finish that I referred to, they call it Fujinon Tex, and it really is gorgeous. It not only looks gorgeous, but it has really great texture in the hand. It immediately gives me a bit of envy, and that I wish all of my other cameras were gripped in this same kind of material. I really, really like it. It feels modern and contemporary. And stylish all at the same time. Really, really great. And so I do love the fit and finish of this camera. One thing that I did note on the original GFX100 is that when you got to the vertical grip portion, it was like it wasn't the same camera. It wasn't even the same materials, the same kind of grip or feel to it. And obviously there is no vertical grip here, but what is here feels much more integrated, and it feels more premium, at least in my hands. Now, you get to the flagship full-size body here. It is a little bit bigger and heavier than the S bodies in every dimension. And so this particular camera is 152 millimeters wide. It is 117.4 millimeters tall, and that's kind of the biggest area of differentiation from, you know, say the GFX100S or GFX50. And the grip is deeper at 98.6. I will note on that, however, is that it's only about a 5 millimeter difference, but I just find this grip so much more comfortable in my hand than what I did the original GFX100. I have medium large size hands, typically a large when it comes to gloves. And so, but even with, you know, having, you know, larger hands than what a lot of people around the world might have, I found that with the original GFX100, it always felt like I was just stretching a little bit to properly hold it. Whereas this, it's contoured really, really great. Everything falls to hand really nice. And that really stood out to me because I just kind of curious as my wife's reaction. She has quite small hands. I gave the camera to her and asked her to, you know, to hold it, to take a few shots of it. And yeah, she commented that it was big, but she says, you know, it actually feels very nice. And that really, to me, kind of stood out as making that difference of showing that this is a camera that really has been ergonomically designed really, really well. Now the weight comes in at 1,030 grams. That is the measurement, by the way, with the battery and memory cards inserted. So that is the heavier of the two potential measurements. And so again, yes, heavier by roughly 100 grams than what, say, the GFX100S was. Now our battery here continues to come from the MPW235 battery that's in a lot of Fujifilm's cameras at this point. It's rated at 540 shots here, or roughly an hour of either 8K or 4K 60 video before the battery is exhausted. A key improvement here is that rather than just having two SD card slots like the other GFX bodies have had, we now have a CF Express Type B along with a single SD card slot there as well. Now that's going to really play a pretty significant difference when it comes to a few other things, including buffer depth and also the kind of video formats and codecs that this baby is able to process. That's a really important upgrade. Another important upgrade in terms of the ergonomics here is that we do have a full-size HDMI port here rather than a mini. And obviously, anytime you have a serious video rig, which as we're going to see this is, you definitely want to have a full-size HDMI port. So that is very welcome there as well. I really like the feel of the memory card door. I'm not as crazy about the covers on the ports on the left side of the camera, mostly because they just kind of dangle here, and when you go to put them back, you have to kind of line things back up. It just doesn't feel as good as when there's an actual kind of more hinged door that comes out. That is certainly my preference. Another revamping here that I really like is that if you view the camera from the side, you can see that there's an 11-degree tilt of the top plate that has the top-mounted LCD screen. And then there's also a tilt moving forward that allows both the buttons, the shutter, and the front wheel all to fall to hand or to finger very, very nicely. But it's really quite clever the way that they've done just this slight degree of tilt on this, because what it does is it makes the top-mounted plate more visible from more angles. Even as I'm sitting here right now, I can see the majority of the information on that top LCD plate. Whereas if it was just flat and facing up, I wouldn't be able to see that. So it's a really, really clever use there. And I will also note that they've kind of reoriented and redesigned the graphical interface on the top-mounted LCD. It's easier to read. It has a little bit more information there. It's sorted just a little bit better. And of course, as has always been the case with these GFX bodies, there is a static display that remains even after the camera is powered off. Another upgrade here is that in between that top LCD plate and then the shutter button, there are now 3 function buttons along there. Those are really important because we're at least one wheel short here. We've got the front wheel that you can also click, the rear wheel you can also click, though I find that kind of interaction a little bit imprecise because sometimes you're clicking, sometimes you're scrolling, and so I don't love that. But what we don't have is a third wheel on the back. So for example, by default, the furthest right of these 3 function buttons, if you hold it down and use the rear wheel, it will allow you to do exposure compensation. It would just be nicer to actually have another wheel where you could just have that set up to automatically do that. Likewise, to change ISO here, I'm having to click the front to change it to another function, then turn the dial or switch between 2 different functions for that. A third wheel would be welcome, and there's plenty of real estate for it. And so, obviously their smaller cameras almost always have lots of dials on them. So it just seems odd that we're missing that on their flagship camera here. To the left side of the removable viewfinder, we have our mode dial, and then beyond that, we have a switch that allows you to switch between movie and stills. And as is the case with many cameras these days that are kind of fully realized for hybrid, when you make that switch, it allows you to set up everything customizable for movie functions, then everything customizable for still functions, making that very, very useful. You can have 2 complete different setups. Now, the removable viewfinder here is really, really fantastic. That's an area that has been significantly updated and improved here. It now has a 9.44 million dot resolution. And I will note that's the same resolution point as my Sony Alpha 1. But it is a night and day comparison between the two. This viewfinder is just so much better, so much more engaging. It has a full, 1.0 times magnification. You look in there and it's like looking at a movie screen inside, and it is the best viewfinder that I've seen to this point. It's getting you right into optical viewfinder territory, but with all of the overlay and information and functionality of an electronic viewfinder. I love it. Now you also have the option of using the optional tilt adapter, and as you can see here, that allows you to either rotate it into different positions, side to side, or to rotate it up into a vertical position for those that prefer that kind of functionality. That tilt adapter is really expensive. It's $570. It seems like a lot for what it actually offers. So you're gonna really want to have that kind of functionality to justify paying that kind of money. So the viewfinder is fantastic. The LCD, not so much, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's basically the same LCD that we've been seeing for a while. It's a 3.2 inch, 2.36 million dots, only so when it comes to the resolution here. It is tiltable on 2 axes. I prefer articulating. I know that some people prefer this format. But what my kind of chief complaint is here is that for as long as I have been reviewing Fuji cameras, I have seen zero improvements when it comes to the touch functionality on their various touchscreens, and they're just not up to the competition's level. And so that's an area that really needs improvement. The other thing is that this is the first camera that I have seen that allows you to use the Fan 001 accessory, which is an active cooling fan. You can mount on this to allow, long format video recording. But not having an articulating screen where you can move the screen fully out of the way makes for a somewhat weird arrangement here. It also means that you may have to compromise even using the LCD screen, depending on how you have it oriented, to be able to actually get that fan mounted. So it's not a great implementation there. That Fan 001 accessory runs you about $200. One final thing that is a standout here is that this is rated by CIPA of 8 stops of its in-body image stabilization, which is the highest rating that I've seen, and it is a fantastic stabilizer. It's huge on having such a high resolution camera. This is 102 megapixels here, and to be able to have great stability and to be able to shoot either video or slow shutter speed handheld shots is really impressive with that, and it works extremely well. I'm very impressed by that. Now, autofocus is typically the area where I have my most complaints with any Fuji camera, and has been particularly true with my reviews of the GFX cameras. I recognize that it's taking different standards, and so some of you have tried to correct me by saying, well, it's, relative to other medium format cameras, autofocus is great. The problem is that Fuji often marks the GFX line as an alternative to full-frame cameras. So through their own marketing materials, they are pitting this against full-frame cameras. And frankly, they've not been at the level of full-frame cameras. And that is still true, though I will say to a lesser degree. As has been the case with most of Fuji's recent cameras, we have the same basic contrast/phase detect hybrid autofocus system. But what has largely changed is the X Processor 5. That X Processor 5 is much faster. It has updated focus algorithms, but it also enables things like the AI learning and various subject tracking. There's a wide range of subjects that you can automatically track, and one thing you can do on the touchscreen is actually click on a subject to actively track it, not just in stills, but also in video mode, something that even the XH line doesn't have at this point, though I suspect we may see that via firmware in the future. So the autofocus is definitely improved. The one thing that I have found is that the autofocus is definitely improved with these most recent Fuji cameras if you have a detectable subject in the frame. Something that the AI can identify, it really kind of steps up the game for the autofocus. Whereas if you're shooting in other environments, the autofocus doesn't feel a whole lot different because frankly, it's not a whole lot different. I've heard some that have kind of hyperbolically claimed that autofocus is now basically identical to an A7R5. Well, as you can see here, using the much more expensive brand new 55mm f1.7 that I've got here versus a really inexpensive Viltrox 28mm f1.8 that I happen to be reviewing on the Sony A7R Mark V at the same time, you can see that there is a marked difference between the autofocus confidence going back and forth in these video captures here. And so no, it is not on A7R5 level in any way, shape, or form. I will say, however, it's getting fairly close to the X-T5, and that in itself is a huge accomplishment. What I found is that IAF works quite good for a variety of subjects, particularly at a distance. And if you're shooting with a lens that allows you to accomplish a really shallow depth of field, when the depth of field is really thin, I find that probably 80% of the time, autofocus, if you look at it critically, is actually on either the eyelash or the eyelid and not on the iris of the eye. So it's not quite as good, as sophisticated as what I see on some other camera platforms. But for most portrait work and at portrait distances, it was great because it would lock onto the eye, and depth of field was enough to where, it wasn't just the eye, but the face that would be in focus. And I got really well focused results and pain-free focus results. I didn't have to kind of fuss around with autofocus. It grabbed onto the eye. I could put subjects, in between I could put objects in between myself and the subject, and I could still lock onto focus all quite well. I also noted that in backlit situations, autofocus worked quite well. There was one situation where autofocus just refused to focus on a closer subject, and I did have to manually focus. But for the most part, even in this other shot here with a very thin depth of field, strong backlighting, I was able to get good focus. Likewise, I shot a photo of a friend golfing, again, very strongly backlit, very directional sun, in early autumn. And despite that, I was able to get really good autofocus on his face, even though he was rotating into his golf shot. So really, really good improvements there. I also noted that in low light situations, autofocus remained quite good. It's rated down to a -6 EV, obviously dependent on the maximum aperture of the lens you have attached. But what I found is that even at shooting at ISO 12,800 in very dim conditions, autofocus locked on without a lot of hesitation. I also note that we have a upgraded burst rate here, up to either 8 frames with the mechanical shutter or as many as 8.7, though with the caveat of shooting in the electronic shutter and shooting with a crop factor there. It means that this can track action better. And so, for example, in shooting these sequences of my son going up for a layup, for the most part, focus was pretty good. I estimate about an 80% success rate as he moved throughout the action. That's a big improvement of what I've seen from the GFX line before. It wasn't reactive enough for Nala moving towards the camera, and I find that often can be a difficult scenario for some cameras, and it takes a reactive camera and lens combination to get good focus in that, and this is not up to that level. What really helps for action, however, is that the buffer is hugely improved. With the original GFX100, you had a limit of 14 uncompressed RAWs. That was your buffer depth. Now uncompressed RAWs were at 76, but it gets much, much bigger if you talk about other formats. For example, with JPEGs, it's unlimited. You can shoot as long as you want to until you run out of battery or card space. When you're shooting lossless compressed RAWs, which is my format of choice, you can get, at the lowest case scenario, you can get 302 before the buffer fills up, and higher figures if you're shooting in other scenarios. Now, there is a blackout in between shots. However, if you shoot, there is a 5.3 frame per second blackout free option that you might want to use, though again, 5.3 frames is not all that fast. And so I found that I could tolerate the 8 or the 8.7 frames per second, depending on what crop I was using. And so, it's definitely improved there. Though at the end of the day, you wonder, who's actually looking to shoot action with the medium format. I think it's less about that and more about really trying to create a hybrid camera that can do the things that a full frame camera can do. Now, when it comes to the video AF side of things, as is commonly the case with Fuji's autofocus, it's just not up to the level of some of the other major brands. And so, the video AF focus pulls using the 55mm f1.7, they were fairly good, though you'll see a little bit of hunting and pulsing, settling, and a little lack of confidence. Likewise, when I went to do my hand test, you'll see that most of the time it was a pretty successful transition, but not quite quick enough for me to have completed the action before it didn't quite get there by the time I was moving on to something else. For the most part, in real world video, I did fairly well. There was one situation, as you can see in the landscape setting, I just got some pulsing back and forth. And so, video AF is still not fantastic. It's kind of like what I see on other Fuji cameras, which again speaks to the progress that Fuji has made, and that I think that their GFX line is pretty much catching up to the X line when it comes to autofocus capabilities. Now, I noted in our intro that video is massively improved here. There's obviously been a really large focus by Fuji in this particular body that they're going to make this a dedicated video type body. So we now have vastly improved specs for what you're able to shoot. You can shoot up to 8K 30, though I will note that is with a fairly large 1.52 times crop. You can shoot 4K up to 4K 60, however, using the full sensor. And there's tons of other options in between. You know, at full HD, you can shoot up to 120 for, slow motion. There's a lot of different framing options and bit rates all the way up to 720 megabits per second. All of that is going to be 10-bit internal, though you can output 12-bit video over HDMI. I will also note that this does enable you to do different codecs, not just kind of the common H.265 or H.264, but you also have the option of doing Apple ProRes inside. And so anyway, definitely some options there. Another interesting thing is that, and by the way, I will note you need to be using the CF Express Type B if you want to shoot Apple ProRes. And in some of those highest bit rates, going to require the faster card, which is why it's there to be, that port is there to begin with. Now, another interesting option is that we have over the USB-C port, there is the ability to record to an external SSD drive, which is really interesting, not just for video, but for stills. And so if you're wanting to record long format, you have the ability to really record long format when recording to an external SSD drive. Very interesting. Another thing that's really unique is that they have designed different crop factors into the camera to allow you to not just utilize GF mount lenses, but also Fuji's own Premista, like cine lenses, cine zooms, and so that's a different crop factor, and there's some different options there. You can go to a 35 millimeter crop, and again, you're gonna have to use adapters to use these, but the ability to use all of these different lens choices really kind of opens up what you can do with this camera. And there's even anamorphic options with a variety of different squeeze ratios and ability to view a de-squeezed in camera. Really interesting stuff there that they've added to it. They've also got F-Log2, which has up to over 14 stops of dynamic range. They've implemented things like waveforms and vector scope to just give you, more visibility on controlling color and luminosity in the frame. Just a lot of interesting things. And so, as I said, they've gone hard at the video market. But again, you kind of wonder, is there a market for this? Were there people that were clamoring for that in the medium format body? And maybe there are, and maybe Fuji has read the room just right. It's not necessarily the feedback I've gotten in the past. So I'm really interested to see how the market reacts to this. But of course, if it does open up a whole new market to kind of a cine side of things for Fujifilm, that's a whole whack of new customers. At the end of the day, however, this is definitely a hybrid camera that's like the XH2 or, a Sony, Nikon, or Canon option that can just do both video and stills really well. Speaking of doing things really well, something that those other brands can't do the way that this camera can do is when it comes to the sensor performance and the image quality. This is a brand new 102 megapixel sensor with a lower base ISO 80, which opens up more dynamic range. It opens up the ability to unlock DR200 and DR400 at lower base points. It makes the overall ISO range a little bit larger. Instead of starting at a base of 100, we're starting at the base of 80. So it's really interesting that this looks on paper like the same sensor, but it's a newly designed sensor from the ground up. Now, the native resolution here is 11,648 by 8,736 pixels. So yeah, those are big files. However, I will note that if you're using the lossless compressed RAW format, which is what I typically choose, those files for stills are usually under 100 megapixels, or excuse me, 100 megabytes per image. So big, but not, ridiculously so. There's actually a lot of file options here. There's JPEG options. There's a lot of different RAW options, uncompressed, lossless, compressed RAWs. You can shoot in HEIF format, you can shoot in DCF or TIFF format. Just a lot of different ways, not only to capture video, but also to capture stills. And obviously with that huge resolution, there is almost endless cropping options here. You can actually own fewer lenses on a camera like this because frankly, you can crop down and get just a variety of different shots out of one image. So let's dive into a deeper dive into the sensor performance, things like dynamic range, like ISO performance, how it holds up in some dedicated tests.
So here is our base setup, kind of our still life that we will use as a part of these tests. And so I just wanted you to take a moment to look at, number one, we'll take a look here at shadow information. As you can see, the shadow is really consistent dark there, and you can see very little noise here. If we take a look in this section here, we can see good contrast. We can see that there's no noise inside of there. And then as we look at these color swatches, we can see the way that they're supposed to look shooting at base ISO, which is ISO 80. Now, typically, I jump right to ISO 1600, which is 5 stops from base ISO. In this case, however, since base ISO is 80, 5 stops up is 1250. So just taking a quick look as we compare at 100% magnification, the areas, for example, on here, where we can see where there could be additional noise that is introduced. Now, we can see that the shadows are not quite as dark, so there's just a little bit of uneven pixelation there. But without having them side by side, you probably wouldn't pick up on it. Likewise, here we can see the contrast looks the same. Color fastness is very good. There's not any kind of real noise that is there. And our color swatches, everything looks fine and normal in this area here, which is where I start to see noise quite often. There's really not much to see. So very, very clean at 5 stops up. So how about if we jump up to 5,000, which is the equivalent of 6,400 on most cameras? It was at this stage where, for example, the 5DSR was just complete garbage. It was just noise everywhere. It was unusable. We can see in this case, though, with the modern advances and also a medium format, you can see that while there's a little bit of extra noise there, it still looks really, really fantastic. We have quite a consistent look overall in the shadows, though not as dark. And we can see that what noise is here is extremely fine. No issues with it at all. Detail still looks great. Color fastness looks great. Not really much to complain about here. Now here I have the minimum native ISO and the maximum native ISO side by side. So we've got 80, we've got 12,800. You can see that looking at the images as a whole, they look very, very similar. I would say there is just a very, very slight drift towards magenta as far as the color balance, but overall you can see that the images don't really look a whole lot different. And if we zoom into a 100% magnification, we can see that contrast still looks quite good. Obviously detail is good, not quite as good, but still looks quite good. There is obviously some additional noise in here, but it's very, very fine noise, nothing radically bad. We can see that there is some uneven pixelation in terms of the shadow area, some lighter pixels there, but by and large, it still looks very clean, even at 100% magnification. Here's an image shot at 12,800, and in particularly with using one of the Acros monochromes here, I think the image really looks actually really great. And I certainly, even at a pixel level, you can see that the detail there is really, really nice. And if we look towards the area here, you can see some very fine noise that is there, but overall it looks really nice and clean. You can see that there's really not a whole lot to be concerned about there. I think that is 100% usable. Now you can go on to an expanded range beyond that, all the way up to 102,400. But I would go up probably another stop beyond this. But within the native range, I would not hesitate to use any of these settings. To me, that's a great looking image right there. Now for testing dynamic range, what we're going to do is, starting with the highlights, we're going to move up, adding overexposing, in this case just by 1 stop, and then taking that stop back out in post-processing. So this is the same image on the right. It's just had a -1 applied to the exposure. And so you can see that that brings us back down to normal. What we're going to look for as we progress is the ability to preserve places where textures start to get blown out. For example, here in this dial, you can see that some of the texture information was lost. It's been regained in post. So that is our ability in post-processing to be able to correct for these things, which is a byproduct of dynamic range. Now, obviously, at this 1 stop overexposure, no problems. We can get all of our color swatches back, get all of the highlight places back, no problem at all. So here at 2 stops of overexposure, you can see that some things are really blown out here at this point. And so let's take a look here at the front of the Pentax face. You can see that's really blown out in this dial that we looked at before. You can see, however, though, that we have basically been able to recover all of that information. So at 2 stops, this is nice and clean. You can see that some of the colors were starting to blow out, but you can see that we've been able to recover them in post without any kind of issue. Now at 3 stops of overexposure, which you can see is extremely overexposed, our ability to recover everything is now lost. You can see that some of the colors, they're not 100% back. You can see, for example, here on this kind of pink color that while we have kind of a darker frame where there's a little bit of shadow there where it's been fully recovered, you can see that in the center of it, a lot of that color swatch has been lost. And then likewise here, you can see that some of that texture information, it just hasn't come back. It doesn't look as it should. In the timer face here, some of the color there has not been brought back either. Now, one of the things that is interesting about Fuji's cameras is that they have opening up at ISO 160 in this case, so 1 full stop up. We have the ability to open up what's called DR200. So in this case, what happens is that the shadow information is sampled from ISO 160, but it would sample the highlight information from 1 stop down. And so in this case, ISO 80. And so going to that base ISO for the highlight. So as we can see, even though it's overexposed 3 stops as before, we can now recover all of these things much, much better because we're basically recovering the equivalent of like a 2 stop of overexposure rather than 3 stops because it's sampling from 1 stop down as far as that. And so we can see, for example, in this color, rather than just having kind of the fringe, we can retain that full color. We can see here that we've got that texture information back without the loss of highlights. Now, if we move on to ISO 320, it opens up DR400, which is the upper limit there. So now we're taking the shadow information from ISO 320, but we're going 2 stops back to the ISO 80 base ISO for the highlights. Now, it's still 3 stops of overexposure, but what we can see here is that if we take a look at some of these blown out highlights, we can see that now there's even more of that texture information that has been brought back. It just looks cleaner in general, just a little bit more consistent even in terms of the color consistency here on the timer face. What that also means is that we could overexpose even a stop higher and basically get the equivalent of this equivalent here shooting at the DR400 type setting. So it's always something that I enable, and if I happen to think I'm going to need extra dynamic range, I will adjust up my ISO and so that I bring back that flexibility. Now, testing for shadow recovery is actually really, really simple here. I'm going to jump all the way to 5 stops, which is the maximum I test out to. You can see everything is deeply crushed in shadow by that point, but you can also see with the recovered result on the right that it is a flawless recovery here when it comes to recovering shadow information. We can see looking into this area right here, for example, all of this has come back. Detail looks great. Contrast looks great. There's no noise there in the shadows. Likewise inside of here, all of that information comes right back out. Looks nice and clean. We can look here in the spine of the color swatches, and we can see everything is recovered nicely. There's no color blotching. There's very little noise that is there. It just looks really, really fantastic. Quite an amazing result. In fact, if we put the base ISO result here, which is just perfectly exposed, not been touched at all on the left side, and that fully recovered result, you can see the difference in the shutter speed getting us to 5 stops of underexposure. You can see, putting them side by side, that they actually look remarkably similar. As before, at the limits, I think that there's just a little bit of a shift towards magenta, but if we pop in here to a pixel level, we can see that detail looks really remarkably good there, no problems there, that texture information looks good. And what additional noise is here is just really, really fine. It's not going to be any kind of real issue. Even the contrast here in the shadows looks, for the most part, really remarkably good. This is an incredible recovery result for underexposing to that degree. So having good dynamic range is very useful for giving you options when you post-process. So for example, in this image, it was low directional autumn sun, and so my golfer buddy here was very strongly backlit here, and so I was working out of the shadows. So that's not obviously all that effective, but we can see that because of the good dynamic range, I was able to bring that exposure up on his face and on his body, and you can see now that I have a perfectly clean result with plenty of detail there. I've recovered all that information, but I still have the flexibility of having a nice exposure to the rest of the image. This case on the right, obviously I've been able to bring up the shadow information. I've been able to show you a little bit more of what's going on outside. The question is whether or not that produces a better image. Sometimes seeing what's outside a window is really more distracting than just having a kind of a blown out area where the light is coming into the scene. And so having more dynamic range is very useful, and I would say we have somewhere close to 12.5 stops here for editing, but it's not always the right choice to make. Sometimes leaving some mystery in the shadows or in the highlights is worth doing. In other shots, however, the ability to draw out shadow information and highlight information produces a much nicer end result. So here on the left, you can see the kind of the native result. Because of that great dynamic range, I was able to bring out the full potential of the sky, which looks quite lovely. There's nice gradations of color, some details from the clouds that we can't see here on the left side. Then also in the shadow information, I've been able to just kind of pull them up to taste, where I'm exposing some of the information and the color there while leaving a little bit of contrast with some shadow area. And those are the kind of options that having great dynamic range enables for you. Now, Fuji is known for having great color to begin with, and that is certainly truest when you're talking about their medium format, where you just have really, really beautiful colors that the camera can capture. For portraits here, you can see that the overall colors of the environment are very, very rich, while the colors of my subject look really great. They pop out, and as you can see, if we pop in there and look at a pixel level, you can see skin tones look really nice, and obviously there's a huge amount of detail even at f1.7 from the new 55mm f1.7. And of course, part of what makes medium format so special is its ability to have just incredibly shallow depth of field. And in this case, obviously, if I zoom in here and look at Nala, you can see that the depth of field here is measured in just millimeters, very, very tiny, but then the bleed off to the background is just really, really gorgeous. And finally, I'll note there is one new film simulation here, and this one is called Reala Ace. And so it is a new one just debuting here on the GFX100 Mark II. And so this image has been processed with it. You can see that it, results in a really nice looking image. Just another addition, another option to give you a nice film type look to an image, and it shows up really nicely in this. So in conclusion, obviously that's an amazing sensor, and this thing can produce beautiful, beautiful images. And I will have a review soon of the 55mm f1.7. It's a great lens, by the way, one of my favorites that I've used on this platform thus far. But this is definitely the most advanced and complete Fujifilm medium format camera that we have seen to date. And I would say it's the most robust hybrid larger format camera that the world has ever seen. It's able to do more things around a large sensor than really what we've seen before. It feels really, really great in the hand, and for the most part, the ergonomics are great. I would still love to see that third wheel, but outside of that, I think that Fuji's done a lot of really good things. And in many ways, it's not dissimilar to using the X-H2, a camera that I use often and I really, really like. It's obviously very expensive at $7,500 US, but at the same time, you have to ask the question, what other line has had a 25% price discount for their most recent model? Obviously, in many cases, prices trend up, not down. And so I really do think that Fujifilm is working hard to make their medium format more accessible to the masses. It is very close to acting like a full-frame alternative for many photography types. Not for all of them. This is still not nearly as good as an action camera as a lot of full-frame alternatives. But at the same time, it also provides the kind of images for landscapes or portraits, weddings, those kind of things that full frame just can't match. And because it does have these expanded capabilities, it can even handle some action in those settings in a way that just wasn't really the case before. And so kudos to Fujifilm for building a better camera here. And this is one I think that is going to be really intriguing to those already shooting Fujifilm's medium format. And I think there's enough going on here for those that have been kind of on the fence about whether they want to switch over to medium format from full frame. There might be just enough here to tip you over the edge. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review.
There's also linkage there to an image gallery if you want to look at some photos, and buying links as well. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.